My name is Aidan Kearney, and I'm the founder of Turtleboy Daily News. For the last 2 years, I've been reporting on the murder of John O'Keefe and the prosecution of Karen Read. In doing so, I've exposed unprecedented amounts of corruption in the Massachusetts State Police and the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office. As a result of my relentless journalism and activism, this case has gotten more attention than any murder case since O.J. Simpson. Millions of people now know that Karen Read was framed, and that the people who murdered John O'Keefe were protected by their friends and family in law enforcement. This has led to widespread outrage and demonstrations outside the courthouse and in the streets across the country. Because of the damaging effect that my reporting and protesting has had on the Commonwealth's case and reputation, I was arrested by the same police I've been exposing and charged with 16 counts of felony witness intimidation, conspiracy, and picketing. The charges are completely meritless and were designed to get me to stop reporting and stop leading this movement for justice. An overview of my charges can be found in the video linked in the description. When I first started writing about this case, I made a video called Framed, which was a condensed overview of the case at the time. However, much has come to light since then, including a trial that ended in a hung jury. And as we enter the retrial, an updated version of Framed was needed. This video is the complete summary of the most important facts of the case.
Look how flat this street is!
Which prove undeniably that Karen Read is innocent and that the people who murdered John O'Keefe framed her for their crimes. On January 29th, 2022, Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found dead outside Brian Albert's house in Canton during a severe blizzard. O'Keefe's girlfriend, Karen Read, who had dropped him off there earlier, became the sole suspect and was charged with manslaughter. She was later indicted for second-degree murder. Authorities claimed Read hit O'Keefe with her SUV and fled the scene. However, emerging evidence pointed to O'Keefe being beaten inside Albert's house and left on the lawn to frame Karen Read. The well-connected Albert family has been protected by their friends and family in law enforcement and the DA's office. They expected Karen Read to give up and take a plea deal, but instead she fought back, uncovering details of the conspiracy surrounding the case. Karen Read was arrested and charged with manslaughter on February 1st, 2022. Her attorney, David Yannetti, did not allege any conspiracy to frame his client at her February 2nd arraignment. Outside of court, Yannetti simply said,
I think that there was a lot of political pressure on this district attorney's office to bring charges in light of the fact that a police officer was the victim here. This is a defensible case. I will tell you that my client has no criminal intent. She loved this man. She is devastated.
He did not state or suggest that his client did in fact strike O'Keefe with her car. Karen was admittedly drunk on the evening of January 28th and had no memory of hitting John O'Keefe with her car. She says that she saw him go into the house, but had no idea how he ended up dead on the lawn. She began to wonder if she could have accidentally bumped into John without realizing it. One thing that didn't cross her mind in the days after John died was that the people inside Brian Albert's house would beat him up and throw him on the lawn to die like trash. That changed on February 3rd, 2022, the day after Read's arraignment. Yannetti was visited in his Boston office by a man named Steve Scanlon. Scanlon was a former corrections officer and a longtime friend of Brian Albert. He told Yannetti that he should look at the people inside the house and opined that O'Keefe was beaten up by Brian Albert, an ATF agent, and Albert's nephew, and that they later moved his body to where Read found him at 6 a.m. Although Scanlon didn't specify names, didn't mention Colin Albert or Brian Higgins in particular, they were the only ones who matched this description who were at the house that night. This was the first time Karen had heard that Colin was at the house, and it suddenly started making sense what had happened. From that point on, she began investigating the investigation into her and discovered that she was being framed. Scanlon wanted to be a whistleblower, but since he's a coward, he also wanted to remain anonymous and wouldn't sign an affidavit for David Yannetti. When I spoke with Scanlon, he told me that he didn't know for sure what had happened to John, but said that the injuries to John, quote, didn't add up. There's just one problem with that, though. John's autopsy photos weren't released at that time, and his injuries hadn't been reported by any media outlets. So Scanlon would have no idea what his injuries were. Scanlon wasn't wrong, though. When people get run over by cars, they generally have bruises all over their body and broken bones. Not John O'Keefe, though. He had no bruises or broken bones below his nose, but he did have 2 black eyes, defensive wounds on his knuckles, a 3-inch laceration in the back of his head, indicating that he had been hit by a blunt object, and what appears to be dog bites exclusively on his right arm. You don't have to be a doctor to know that a car did not do that. Karen Reed and John O'Keefe dated 20 years ago and reconnected romantically after speaking on Facebook during the pandemic. During those 20 years, John left his job as a Duxbury police officer to join the Boston Police Department. In 2014, John's sister and brother-in-law tragically died in less than 3 months of each other, leaving John's young niece and nephew without their parents. John stepped up and became their parent, raising them alone and moving to Canton. Karen worked for Fidelity as a financial analyst and was an adjunct professor at Bentley University. She owned a home in Mansfield, but for all intents and purposes was cohabitating with O'Keefe and acting as a de facto stepmother to O'Keefe's niece and nephew. Text messages leading up to the night O'Keefe was killed show that Reed felt taken advantage of by John, as some referred to her as the, quote, babysitter with benefits. Ouch. John didn't like how she spoiled the kids. They argued, as many couples do, sometimes in front of the kids, and discussed breaking up. There was an incident in Aruba a month before John died, where Karen angrily confronted a woman named Marietta Sullivan and accused her of kissing John. And Karen was frustrated that John got drunk during the trip and left her to take care of his kids. Karen herself sought validation and attention from an ATF agent friend of John's named Brian Higgins, who she flirted with over texts in January of 2022, but ultimately ended up ghosting him after a tap kiss in John's garage 2 weeks before John died. One time, John told Karen to leave the house, but they never ended up breaking up because Karen was so helpful with the children. Despite their occasional arguments, John and Karen were lovey-dovey at C.F. McCarthy's on the night that she allegedly killed him and was described by witnesses to be affectionate towards one another. On Friday, January 28th, the huge winter storm coming to Massachusetts was all over the news. John and Karen texted back and forth all day, talking about problems in their relationship. But whatever issues they had with each other wasn't enough to keep them apart that night, as John repeatedly invited her to Canton to drive him around to the bars and get snowed in with him and the kids for the weekend. John went out to a local bar called C.F. McCarthy's with his friends Mike Camerano and Kurt Roberts. Karen drove in from Mansfield and met them there at 9 p.m. She immediately began ordering drinks and could be seen on camera paying for 4. By 11 o'clock, Reed and O'Keefe made plans to go to a bar across the street and meet up with a woman named Jennifer McCabe, who O'Keefe was friends with because his niece was friends with one of McCabe's 4 daughters. McCabe was at the bar with her husband, Matt McCabe, her sister, Nicole Albert, Nicole's husband, Brian Albert, Brian's brother, Chris Albert, and Chris's wife, Julie Albert. Joining them there was Brian Higgins, the ATF agent Reed had previously flirted with earlier in the month before, quote, ghosting him. While they were there, Jennifer McCabe invited O'Keefe to Brian Albert's house for an after party, where Brian Albert Jr. was celebrating his 23rd birthday with several friends and his 17-year-old cousin, Colin Albert. One witness described McCabe as trying to separate John from Karen, who had no interest in going to an after party at a stranger's house. After an hour, the bar closed and Brian and Nicole Albert left to go back to their home at 34 Fairview Road. Higgins can be seen on video yelling and pointing in O'Keefe's direction before being held back and restrained by Chris Albert. While he was at the bar, he had texted O'Keefe's girlfriend, well, as if to say, why are you ignoring me? He was drunk, upset with O'Keefe, and felt disrespected by O'Keefe's girlfriend. When Nicole and Brian Albert got back home, they testified that their nephew Colin was still there, but that he left within a few minutes. Colin claimed that he had been there for 90 minutes, dropped off earlier in the evening by Jennifer McCabe's daughter, Allie, so that he could wish his much older cousin, Brian Albert Jr., a happy birthday. Despite being a teenage meathead who loves to drink and party, Colin's story is that he left the house minutes after his fun uncle arrived to the party because he wanted to get home, kiss his parents goodnight, and go to bed. Right. Physical violence and toughness are things that are encouraged amongst male members of the Albert family. Brian Albert is a former Marine and trained boxer with 30 years of experience as a Boston police officer, serving on the fugitive unit where he was in charge of tracking down and arresting some of the most violent and dangerous criminals. He reportedly assaulted 2 other Boston police officers named Eddie Hernandez and Stephen Ridge and had a bad reputation amongst the rank and file in the BPD. Chris Albert is a thug who has political power in town. On June 23rd, 2024, he threatened to beat my face up and down the sidewalk outside C.F. McCarthy.
Up and down the sidewalk in 2 seconds.
You'll beat my face.
No, I wouldn't. I could.
You could, yeah. You seem really intimidated.
Then watched gleefully as one of his employees and his crazed sister-in-law, Jill Daniels, assaulted me on camera.
Oh, look who it is. Look who's here.
Chris,
Here she is.
you know what? I'm so sick of your shit.
Chris knew he can get away with this because the McAlberts basically run the town of Canton. Chris is on the board of selectmen. His brother Kevin Albert's a detective sergeant. Brian Albert is a legend, and Tim Albert once owned a pool. As a member of the select board, Chris is in charge of hiring the police chief who works for him. Unsurprisingly, Chief Helena Rafferty and former Chief Ken Berkowitz both supported Chris Albert's campaign for selectmen and used their positions of authority to cast doubt on what was plainly a cover-up in the eyes of any rational person. Chief Berkowitz allowed Brian Higgins to have an office at the Canton Police Department and asked a reporter to take down a tweet on February 1st, 2022, because the tweet mentioned the fact that John O'Keefe's body was found on Brian Albert's front lawn, and Brian Albert was a, quote, pillar of the community who didn't deserve to have his reputation tarnished. In November of 2023, the people of Canton held a special town meeting where they voted to audit the police department despite the select board and Chris Albert voting 5-0 not to. Colin was the star of the Canton High School football team and the quintessential jock who thought football was cool but Shakespeare was a loser. He was also neighbors with O'Keefe and had reportedly gotten into shouting matches with his much older neighbor after throwing beer cans on O'Keefe's lawn. Colin's parents jokingly referred to O'Keefe as Nebbercracker in reference to a grumpy cartoon character who didn't like people on his lawn. Colin has a history of violence and has gotten into several fights that were memorialized on video. He had also issued disturbing threats to a group of teenage hockey players from Hingham known as the Advantage Boys.
Yo, your Advantage Boys, I will beat all your asses. I promise you, I will fuck you all up. Pull up, bitch.
Despite this, Colin claimed during the trial that he had never been in a fight before, something that was undeniable perjury. Like many others, Colin looked up to and admired his uncle Brian. Family photos of the Alberts almost always show the men either giving the middle finger to the camera or holding up their fists like boxers do. The Commonwealth wants us to believe that as soon as his uncle Brian got back to the party, Colin just immediately decided it's time to leave. Colin, Chris, and Julie Albert have all known State Police Detective Michael Proctor for decades. And as luck would have it, Proctor ended up being assigned lead investigator for O'Keefe's murder. 7-year-old Colin was the ring bearer in Proctor's sister Courtney's wedding. There's pictures of Colin and his family all over Courtney's Facebook page. And Proctor's own mother referred to the Alberts as a, quote, second family. Yet Proctor did not recuse himself from the investigation or disclose this close relationship. In fact, he denied knowing that when he testified in front of the grand jury that indicted Reed. He said he didn't know him. Karen discovered by researching the Albert and Proctor families on social media this was a lie. Throughout the investigation, Proctor went out of his way to protect the McAlberts by treating them as witnesses instead of potential suspects and not interviewing eyewitnesses and even accepting bribes from the Alberts on the day that Reed was arrested. Shortly after Brian and Nicole arrived at 34 Fairview Road, Jennifer and Matt McCabe pulled into the driveway and parked there. At 12:14, John O'Keefe had just left the Waterfall Bar with Karen Reed and texted Jen McCabe asking where to. At 12:18, he called her asking her to clarify directions. Unfamiliar with the town that she didn't live in, Karen went slightly out of the way to get there, coming from the east on Cedar Crest Road. She missed the left-hand turn onto Fairview Road, did a U-turn in the driveway, and then she went back to Fairview Road. When she did so, a truck was coming from the opposite direction and was trying to turn left onto Fairview Road. Inside that truck was Ricky D'Antano, Heather Maxon, and her boyfriend Ryan Nagel, whose sister Julie Nagel was a friend of Brian Albert Jr. and had called him looking for a ride home. D'Antano allowed Reed to turn onto 34 Fairview and drop John off in the driveway, where she claims that she saw him run quickly to the side door. D'Antano, Maxon, and Nagel pulled in seconds afterwards and testified that they did not see John O'Keefe run into the house, which would make sense because the other cars in the driveway would have obstructed their view from seeing him. Karen had no intention of going inside because she didn't know anyone there. And throughout the whole scene, she just thought it was sketchy because the house was dark and Higgins had just yelled at O'Keefe before leaving the bar. But John was drunk and wanted to go, so she agreed to drop him off. The plan was for him to call or text her that he was inside to let her know everything was fine and she'd go back to his house 3 miles away at One Meadows Ave, where his 14-year-old niece was home alone. But John never called or texted Karen Reed again. As she waited outside, she became frustrated with John for not calling her and assumed that he had once again gotten drunk and left her to take care of his kids. After 10 minutes, she left and drove back to John's house, leaving all sorts of angry voicemails and text messages accusing him of cheating on her. This is the exact opposite opposite thing that you would do if you just murdered someone. Scott Peterson and countless other killers have left voicemails for their victims, pretending to be worried about them.
Hey, beautiful. I just left a message at home. 2:15. I live in Berkeley. I won't be able to get to Villa Farms to get that basket for Papa. I was hoping you would get this message and go on out there. I'll see you in a bit, sweetie. Love you. Bye.
Reed's messages indicated that she thought John was alive, possibly with another woman, and had left her alone to watch his children. Who wouldn't be pissed? According to Trooper Nicholas Garino, Karen Reed logged into John's Wi-Fi at 12:36 a.m. The 2.3-mile trip from Fairview Road to One Meadows Ave, which included going through a traffic light in the center of town, would have taken at least 6 minutes in ideal conditions. In the snow, it would take much longer. That means Karen had to leave Fairview Road no later than 12:30 a.m. This presents a huge problem for the Commonwealth. Ricky D'Antano, Heather Maxson, and Ryan Nagel all testified that Julie Nagel came out and said that she was going to stay there instead. They all left while Karen Reed was still parked outside and drove by her Lexus. All three of them testified that they saw Karen Reed alone in her car with the interior lights on, in her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. None of them saw John O'Keefe inside the car with Karen Reed. None of them saw O'Keefe on the ground outside the car or standing outside the car. This means there could only be one place that O'Keefe was, inside Brian Albert's house. The forensic evidence backs this up. John's Apple Health data shows that he ascended and descended 3 flights of stairs between 12:22 and 12:24 a.m. Karen's Apple Health data does not show her going up any flights of stairs during that time. This means that Reed and O'Keefe could not be in the same place at that time. Brian Albert has 2 flights of stairs in his house. Karen Reed's Lexus doesn't have a basement. Don't worry though, the Commonwealth has an explanation for that. You see, John's GPS, which has a 3-minute standard deviation from the actual time, shows that he wasn't there yet at 12:22. According to Detective Garino, the Norfolk DA's forensic expert, John was on Oakdale Road and was probably moving the phone up and down in the car.
The movement of the phone, the distance traveled, it's going to register as steps. You don't have to physically be walking and moving the phone for it to register movements. Just waving it around and then could potentially cause it to think you're walking and moving.
Which somehow tricked Apple into believing that he had just climbed a couple flights of stairs. Garino testified that it was a very hilly street, so I tried driving down Oakdale Road to see if I could get my Apple Health data to say I climbed stairs. This is what I found.
Look how flat this street is. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Watch out for the hill, kid.
The flattest street in Canton. Unsurprisingly, my Apple Health data did not show that I had climbed any flights of stairs. D'Antano, Maxson, and Ryan Nagel all testified that there were no cars in between them and Reed's Lexus. This presented a problem for the Commonwealth, so they had to try to find a way to discredit them. The solution to this was for Matt McCabe, Jen McCabe, and Brian Higgins to make up a lie that Higgins had parked his white Jeep next to Brian Albert's mailbox, which would have been in between the Lexus and D'Antano's truck.
And after the end of the driveway, there was a Jeep. And after the Jeep was the SUV, the dark SUV.
You did not see, for instance, a Jeep with a snowplow on the front parked in between you.
I did not.
And in fact,
you indicated that that Jeep was just a little bit in front of the mailbox, meaning about there, correct?
Yes.
You certainly did not see a full-sized Jeep Wrangler outfitted with a snowplow between the SUV and Ricky's truck.
I did not.
I want to ask a question about Mr. Higgins. Mm-hmm. You said on Friday that you saw his vehicle when you got to the scene, correct?
Yes.
And you said that it was pulled up a little bit in front of the mailbox, correct?
Yes.
Did any car pull in between Ricky's truck and the SUV when you were sitting behind the SUV?
No, sir.
You didn't see a Jeep?
No, sir.
With a big old snowplow on the front of it?
No, sir, I did not.
That car was never between your car and the SUV, was it?
I never saw any other vehicle in between us.
And then after the end of the driveway, there was a Jeep. And after the Jeep was the SUV, the dark SUV.
Timeline of Karen getting back to One Meadows Ave at 12:36 was also problematic because Jen McCabe testified that she looked out the window 3 times and Karen was still there at 12:45. The Commonwealth claims that Karen struck John with her car at 12:32, meaning she couldn't get back to O'Keefe's house by 12:36, and she definitely wouldn't still be at Brian Albert's house at 12:45. In order to make it look like she was worried about where John was, Jennifer McCabe called his phone 6 times between 12:40 and 12:50. She later testified that they were actually butt dials, none of which resulted in a voicemail being left on John's phone because she would hang up and then, I guess, butt dial again. Then there's the Canton Library video, which perfectly captures the intersection in the middle of town that Karen would have driven through on her way back to John's house. If she had just hit John with her car, then her taillight would be visibly broken on that surveillance video and they could nail her. The IT director, Louis Jutras, gave state police a share file with all the footage from that night, which Proctor then burned onto a CD. When he did that, the footage from the 2-minute window where Reed drove drove by was mysteriously missing. You got that? It recorded everything except for when the woman with the allegedly broken taillight drove by. How convenient. But the library wasn't the only place that surveillance videos that could have shown the condition of Reed's taillight as she drove back to John's house. There's hundreds of homes along the way, many of which have Ring cameras. Did police ask any of these homeowners to look at them? I randomly stopped and asked a homeowner who told me no one ever asked him for his.
What is it you need to know now?
So I was just wondering, did the state police ever come by here and ask for Ring camera footage from the morning of January 29th, 2022?
No, they haven't.
They haven't.
Normally, police canvass all over town asking for Ring and other surveillance videos, but the murder of a Boston cop wasn't worthy of that sort of effort, apparently. They knew Reed's taillight wasn't broken at 12:35, and they knew that asking to look at videos would exonerate her. Inside the house, when Karen Reed left, were Matt McCabe, Jen McCabe, Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Brian Albert Jr., Caitlin Albert, Julie Nagel, Brian Higgins, and Albert Jr.'s friend, Sarah Levinson. But for some reason, people didn't question Nagel or Levinson until 9 months after O'Keefe's death, and Caitlin Albert, Brian Albert Jr., and several others until 18 months later, despite the fact that they all would have likely heard or seen a murder less than 50 feet from where they were standing. Proctor had no interest in speaking with any of these people. Not a single person inside the house reported hearing a man who was invited over the house being hit by a car outside. Matt and Jen McCabe testified that they were looking out the window frequently. Matt McCabe even said that he saw V-shaped tire tracks in the snow. Remarkably, neither of them noticed John O'Keefe's body on the front lawn. John was 6'2", 220 and was found just 10 feet from the curb. Yet not a single person saw his body as they drove directly past where the Commonwealth claims O'Keefe's body was, which would have been illuminated by the bright white snow. They all had their own excuses for that, including peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Then there's Tristan Morris and Caitlin Albert. Tristan was at the waterfall with his girlfriend Caitlin, but left early to go back to their apartment in East End and sleep for a couple hours before waking up to plow. Caitlin planned on staying the night at her parents' house at 34 Fairview Road. But for some unexplained reason, Tristan was woken up in the middle of the night by Caitlin, who told him to come and pick her up. What happened to change your plans? Perhaps a Boston police officer was beaten to death inside the home that she was supposed to sleep in that night. In Michael Lang's police report, it says that he spoke with Brian and Nicole Albert, who told him that Caitlin Albert left at 12:15 with Tristan. Conveniently, this would have gotten her out of the house before John and Karen arrived, and thus police would have no reason to question her. But after Caitlin and her parents received a summons from the FBI to testify at the federal grand jury, the Alberts were advised by their attorney, Greg Henning, not to lie about when they left because the feds already knew the answer to that. Caitlin admitted that Tristan did not pick her up until 1:45. And when Brian Albert was asked about the 12:15 time in Lank's report, Albert blamed Lank for writing down the wrong time. If police knew that Tristan had picked up Caitlin at 1:45, it would make Tristan a witness since he would have driven right past where John O'Keefe was allegedly dying of hypothermia. At trial, Tristan claimed that he never saw a body on the lawn because he was distracted, just like everyone else who left the house that night. The more people involved in a conspiracy, the harder it is for everyone to keep their story straight. This is why Brian Albert and Jennifer McCabe went out of their way to say that their kids had all left before John and Karen arrived. Less people to interview means less people to tell a different version of events of the story. After Jennifer McCabe got home from dropping off Julie Nagel and Sarah Levinson, her Apple Health data shows that she went upstairs and was pacing around all morning. Her heart rate shows that she never went to sleep. Something was on her mind. Then, at 2:27 and 40 seconds, she Googled the most incriminating thing she could possibly have Googled. How long to die in cold? Except she spelled it Hoslong to die in cold. Why would she Google this if she thought John O'Keefe had decided to go home with Karen Reed and never went inside Brian Albert's house? She had to have known that the plan was to put O'Keefe's body out on the lawn to make it look like he had died from hypothermia after being struck by a car. McCabe must have realized it was a huge mistake to Google this because the Cellbrite extraction report of her phone shows that she deleted the search along with 18 phone calls made that morning. In order to cover her tracks, she planned to Google the same thing the same exact way after O'Keefe's body was found because it would be more explainable after finding out he was lying in the snow. She ended up doing this at 6:24 but claims Karen Reed was the one who told her to do this while John O'Keefe was being wheeled into the ambulance. However, according to Sergeant Good's testimony, Karen Reed was alone in a car at 6:24 and dash camera footage confirms this. Jennifer McCabe was trying to cover her tracks. The answer to Jen's question is 1 to 2 hours. That's all it would take for a person to die from hypothermia in an 18-degree snowstorm. If Karen Reed struck struck John O'Keefe with her car at 12:32, then he should have been dead when his body was discovered at 6 a.m. But he wasn't, so he couldn't have been out there for very long. Jennifer McCabe handed her phone over to police just days after O'Keefe's death, and the contents were all extracted by Detective Garino. Nowhere in Garino's report did it mention anything about a deleted Google search for Hoss Long to Die in Cold at 2:27 a.m. In fact, it didn't show the 6:24 search for the same thing either. And as it turned out, Garino has a history of manipulating Cellbrite data extraction reports. In February of 2021, a pregnant woman named Sandra Birchmore was found dead in her Canton apartment, in what state police, many of whom were involved in the Reed investigation, immediately determined was a suicide by hanging with a belt. Birchmore was last visited in her apartment by 6'4" Stoughton police detective Matthew Farwell, who had impregnated her and wasn't happy about it due to the fact that he was married with 2 kids and was about to have a third. Farwell met Birchmore when he was working in the Stoughton High School Explorers program. She was just 15 years old when he started having sex with her, and 23 when she died. But Farwell was never treated as a real suspect, just as the people inside Brian Albert's house were never treated as suspects. He handed over his phone to Garino, who said that he couldn't retrieve 32,709 text messages between Birchmore and Farwell, much like he couldn't find Jennifer McCabe's Google searches because they were deleted too. But Cellbrite extracts deleted messages and Google searches as well. Luckily, the FBI ended up looking into the case and found all the deleted messages showing that Farwell was into violent rape fantasies. In August of 2024, he was arrested by the FBI for murder. If it was up to Garino, the Canton police, and Lieutenant John Fanning, another one of Proctor's bosses who was in charge of the Birchmore investigation, Farwell would still be walking the streets today. The Google search was not discovered until April of 2023 when Reed's forensic expert Richard Green found it. This is what ultimately caught my attention and led to widespread publicity that the case wasn't getting before. Like many, I assumed the DA's office was run by ethical people who wouldn't knowingly prosecute an innocent woman, especially when there was evidence that someone inside the house was responsible for John's murder. But I underestimated just how corrupt they were and just how determined they were to get Karen Reed. 2 days after my first article reached millions of people and outrage was spreading over the case, the DA's office announced they weren't dropping the charges and would be disputing the 227 Google search, which they claimed never happened. But how could they know this on April 20th, 2023 if they hadn't hired their own expert yet?
Any comment on that? Why you Googled that at 227? Any comment, Mr. McCabe? Any comment? How can you show your face in court? Aren't you embarrassed? Aren't you ashamed? What are you hiding? What did you do? Why did you delete all those phone calls, Ms. McCabe? Why did you delete all those phone calls? Why did you delete your Google search?
The Google search was not discovered until April of 2023 when Reed's forensic expert Richard Green found it. This is what ultimately caught my attention and led to widespread publicity that the case wasn't getting before. Like many, I assumed the DA's office was run by ethical people who wouldn't knowingly prosecute an innocent woman, especially when there was evidence that someone inside the house was responsible for John's murder. But I underestimated just how corrupt they were and just how determined they were to get Karen Reed. 2 days after my first article reached millions of people and outrage was spreading over the case, the DA's office announced they weren't dropping the charges and would be disputing the 227 Google search, which they claimed never happened. But how could they know this on April 20th, 2023 if they hadn't hired their own expert yet? Over the next 6 months, they went searching for experts who would tell them what they wanted to hear. Jennifer McCabe might not have Googled Hoss Long to Die in Cold at 2:27 a.m. 2 months later, they found Jessica Hyde, whose report left open the possibility that the search may have happened at 2:27. Unsatisfied, they somehow came across a former Calgary, Alberta police officer named Ian Whiffen, who worked for Cellbrite and was promoting his new app called ArtX. Whiffen greenlights updates to Cellbrite software and was able to make sure that the 227 Google search did not come up on the updated version. He spent much of his testimony promoting his own app, which Cellbrite did not endorse. Somehow, the Commonwealth knew on April 20th that 7 months later, they would have an expert from Canada who would reach this conclusion. Karen Reed was furious with her boyfriend for ignoring her calls and texts and leaving her alone to watch John's niece. She fell asleep sometime around 1:30 and woke up at 4:30. This time, her emotions changed from angry to worried. John would never not come home to his niece and nephew, and he would never ignore that many phone calls from Reed. He was drunk, the weather conditions were dangerous, and she began to become extremely worried that something horrible happened. She woke up John's niece and used her phone to call Jennifer McCabe at 4:53 a.m., who was awake and had never gone to sleep all night for some reason. By that point, John's body hadn't been on the lawn for very long, if it was even there at all. Jen needed to delay Karen from going to 34 Fairview Road. She told Karen that John never came inside that house, but volunteered to go out looking for him with Karen. She invited Karen to come to her house, and Karen is seen backing into John's Chevy Traverse in the driveway as she went out looking for him at 5:07 a.m., cracking her rear taillight in the process. Karen went towards the waterfall bar first, then drove back towards Jen McCabe's house. Her car is seen a mile and a half from McCabe's house at 5:18 a.m., but since she didn't know Canton very well and had no idea how to get to McCabe's house, she pulled over in the Canton cemetery, and her phone records show that she called her parents and Googled McCabe's address. She ended up getting there at 5:35 and picked up Jen, who convinced her to go back to One Meadows Ave to search the house for John, as if he would jump out of the closet and yell, "Peekaboo!" This was all part of Jen's plan to delay Karen from returning to 34 Fairview Road. Jen and Karen were met at John's house by his friend Kerry Roberts, and after searching the house without taking their shoes off, something the Commonwealth would later claim was evidence that she murdered John, the three of them jumped into Kerry's car and headed towards Fairview Road. When they arrived there, Karen immediately saw John's body on the lawn where she had been idling her car, waiting for him to call her back and say everything was okay inside. She jumped out of the car, rushed over to John, who was lying with a cell phone underneath his body, and began to perform CPR. Meanwhile, Jennifer McCabe called 911 and told them
34 Fairview Road is getting out. There's a man passed out in the snow.
So this is Jennifer McCabe. She says she's at 34 Fairview Road. And by the way, on the official police report, it actually says 32 Fairview Road. She says 34 Fairview Road at least 3 times in this tape, and they still put 32 Fairview Road. They also don't put Brian Albert Sr.'s name on it. They just put B. Albert. He's the only one not listed out. But listen to what she says there. There's a man passed out in the snow. Now, keep in mind, who this man? No. She knows who this man is because Karen Reed has gotten out of the car already and said, "There's John." And they're literally looking for John, and they get out of the car when they see him. So she knows who it is. She said there's a man passed out in the snow. Now, keep in mind, this is a quote unquote man who she was just with 6 hours prior. She was just with him 6 hours prior. At the very least, according to her own story, they were together at the waterfall bar, and she invited him back to that house. She says Kerry 7 times. And I think she says Jen here.
I know I'm on the phone with the ambulance. I know.
I know that sound. I know that. Listen to the fear in her voice. When Karen jumped out of the car, she was calling O'Keefe and left her phone in Kerry's car. A 4-minute voicemail was left on O'Keefe's machine that picked up McCabe's 911 call, which was immediately followed by McCabe whispering what sounded like, "No one's coming out to help." Jennifer McCabe phone records show that she called her sister Nicole Albert inside the house at 6:07 and 6:08 and spoke to her for durations of 7 and 9 seconds. Not enough time to have a conversation, but enough time to say, "Stay inside, no one's coming out to help." The first call happened at the exact time that you can hear Jennifer whispering, "No one's coming out to help." Nicole Albert was awake, and Jen McCabe was telling her to stay inside the house. For some reason, Jennifer McCabe deleted those 2 answered phone calls to her sister. Both she and Nicole claimed that the 2 answered phone calls were never answered and that she never deleted them, even though Jen's phone records show that she did. Disputing forensic data is a common theme with the McAlberts and the Commonwealth. Officer Saraf was the first cop who arrived on the scene. His report says nothing about a car accident or Karen Reed uttering incriminating statements. Yet at the grand jury several months later, his story evolved, and he claimed that Reed said, "This is all my fault." Although the Canton police were the first to respond to the scene, they were ultimately conflicted off of the case because O'Keefe's body was discovered on Brian Albert's front lawn, and Brian Albert's brother, Kevin, is a detective in the Canton Police Department. Kevin Albert is drinking buddies with Proctor, who was later reprimanded when text messages revealed that the 2 of them had done some day drinking while investigating a cold case on Cape Cod, and Kevin Albert woke up hungover and realized that he left his gun and badge in Proctor's work vehicle. Oops. Paramedics arrived shortly after Officer Saraf, which included a woman named Katie McLaughlin, a close personal friend of Caitlin Albert. They graduated high school together, did cross country, and are photographed together in countless social situations up until a few months before O'Keefe's death, including trips to the beach, hot tubs, and a baby shower. Despite this, both she and Caitlin lied at the trial and said that they were just acquaintances who went to high school together. McLaughlin was one of nearly a dozen paramedics who responded to the scene, yet she was the only one police spoke with prior to Reed's arrest. On January 30th, Kevin Albert told Proctor that he wanted Proctor to interview McLaughlin and offered up Canton Police Department headquarters to do so, despite the fact that CPD was supposed to be conflicted off the case specifically because of Kevin Albert. McLaughlin told Proctor that she heard Reed say, "Hit him, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him," at the scene, while Reed was standing next to Jennifer McCabe, Officer Saraf, and McLaughlin, while Keefe was already in the ambulance. That was her story. There's just a couple problems with that, though. Officer Saraf, 4 other cops, and 5 other first responders testified that Karen Reed never said, "I hit him." And police dash cam footage shows that when these 4 were standing together, John wasn't in the ambulance yet. Karen was arrested 2 days after McLaughlin told Proctor she said, "I hit him." And according to firefighters Anthony Flamati and Timothy Nuttall, they talked about her case every day at the firehouse. Yet no other firefighters besides McLaughlin were ever questioned by Proctor until February 8th. By that time, the "I hit him" lie was all over the news and was the talk of the firehouse. And thus, Nuttall and Flamati both told Proctor that she said it. However, on cross-examination, it was revealed that neither of them was anywhere near Karen when McLaughlin claims that Karen uttered those words, despite the fact that there was a hysterical woman screaming on their front lawn, bright, flashing fire and police lights illuminating the area, and an aggressive German shepherd that barked a lot and easily spooked inside the house, and phone data showing Nicole Albert spoke to Jennifer McCabe at 6:07. Brian and Nicole Albert claimed that they slept through the whole thing. Brian Albert, a trained first responder, did not come out of the house while a fellow Boston police officer was lying dead on his front lawn. The bedroom window was the closest to where O'Keefe's body was found, and they testified that Chloe was in the room with them. But Chloe, Brian, and Nicole did not wake up. However, their neighbors in what Matt McCabe would later call the Asian house did wake up and take these pictures showing how impossible it would be to sleep through it. Canton Police Sergeants Sean Good and Michael Lank and Lieutenant Paul Gallagher arrived after Seraph, all of whom spent their entire lives in Canton. Good graduated and was friends with Courtney Proctor and Julie Albert's sister Jillian Daniels. Lank was good friends with Chris Albert since high school, and 20 years prior he was involved in a drunken bar fight in which he came to the rescue of Chris and assaulted and arrested 2 brothers who Chris had started trouble with. None of these 3 cops had any sort of curiosity or suspicion about how a dead cop ended up on Brian Albert's front lawn. John didn't seem dressed for the weather and was missing a shoe. If you or I invited a cop to our house and he ended up being found dead on our lawn with only 1 shoe on, the cops are definitely going to ask to search the house and get a warrant if you said no. But this was Brian Albert's house, a well-respected veteran police officer. As Proctor's text messages would later show, they weren't going to hassle him, and they claimed there was no probable cause to search the house, despite the fact that none of them applied for a warrant so a judge could determine that for them. For all they knew, John had been killed by someone who also killed the people inside the house. Yet they allowed Jennifer McCabe to go into the house by herself at 6:34 a.m., where she claims she woke up sleeping Brian and Nicole. Jennifer McCabe was the quarterback of the entire cover-up. She didn't cause John's injuries, but she was essential for making sure that those who did were never held responsible. Jen made sure to speak with every police officer that she could in order to push the narrative that Karen was responsible for John's being on the lawn. Dash cam footage shows Jen turning her back as John's body was being wheeled into the ambulance. She was too busy talking to Officer Saraf and laying the groundwork for framing Karen Reed. Jen's phone records show that she was talking to Kerry Roberts all day on January 29th, making sure that Kerry, a potential loose end, believed that Karen had killed John. She spoke to John's mother and made her feel the same way. She hid the fact that her cell phone data shows that on January 30th, she went to Sergeant Lank's house for an hour. She never disclosed this, but when confronted with the information at trial, she said that she had just gone there to talk to Lank's wife. Jen continued to show up for Karen Reed's hearings wearing a Justice for JJ button.
How can you wear those buttons when you covered up his murder?
And comforted the grieving family in court. What a psychopath. Soon after that, the sun came out and Lieutenant Gallagher began to search the grassy area where O'Keefe's body was found. There was less than 3 inches of snow on the ground at that time, so he used a leaf blower to clear off the light dusting and search for clues. He found transparent pieces of what appeared to be cocktail glass, but what he didn't find was 47 pieces of bright red taillights, some as big as a dinner plate, that Michael Proctor and the state police would find over the course of the next 3 weeks. The search was conducted on video too. Do you see any red taillight here? Transparent cocktail glass is much harder to see than bright red taillight on bright white snow. This cannot be emphasized enough. There was no taillight anywhere near John's body at 7 a.m., nor was there a missing shoe. Around this time, Karen Reed made statements that she was suicidal and she was sectioned for the next 4 to 5 hours. During this time, the McAlberts were allowed to talk together away from police and get their story straight. At 9 a.m., McCabe called Lank on his cell phone to tell him that she suddenly remembered Karen saying, "Could I have hit him?" Her story later evolved at trial to, "Did I hit him?" But she accused Lank of misquoting her in the original report. Police knew that protecting the crime scene was essential, especially since it was snowing and evidence could easily get buried. But the Canton police just left the crime scene completely abandoned the entire day. No crime scene tape put up, no cops to watch over the area and make sure the scene wasn't tampered with.
The crime scene was completely open.
Yes.
Unsecured.
Yes.
And Brian Albert didn't offer his house up as a command center for officers to come out of the cold. Blood droplets found at the scene were put in red Solo cups.
Just any Solo cups or the Solo cups that you took back to the station from 34 Fairview?
Were acquired from the deputy police chief, Tom Keller, who lived across the street.
It looks like an evidence bag. It just doesn't say Canton Police on it. It says Stop and Shop, but it does look like an evidence bag. It's the same thing.
It should be noted that Kelleher had a Ring camera pointed directly at the area where Commonwealth alleges that John was hit by a car. Michael Proctor never even asked to look at the Ring camera footage.
Because again, this is astounding. Look how close that is. It's right there.
I can even put my camera up there.
Yeah. Like that's the view it would have gotten.
Meanwhile, Proctor and his partner Yuri Buchanan didn't even go to 34 Fairview Road that day to investigate the scene. At 11:30, they decided it was finally time to interview some witnesses. But instead of separating them and recording their interviews at a police station, which is what detectives always do, they decided to interview just 4 witnesses: Jennifer McCabe, Matt McCabe, Nicole Albert, and Brian Albert at the McCabe's house. After being together all morning getting their story straight, the 4 of them drove across town in the middle of a blizzard where they were interviewed by Proctor and Buchanan. At no point was anyone in the house treated as a potential suspect who had to be ruled out. Their story was a simple one and was blindly taken as gospel by police. John O'Keefe never came in the house. But this story strained credulity because there's no possible way that none of them would hear or see a 3-ton vehicle striking a man, and that none of them would see his body laying on the lawn when they left. The 4 McAlberts all told the same story. They went out to the bar, things seemed fine, Karen and John pulled up outside, he never came in, she left, and in the morning, when Jen and Karen went out looking for him, Karen had a cracked taillight and said, "Could I have hit him?" upon finding his body. That was it. That was all Michael Proctor needed to hear to determine that Karen Reed was the killer. He didn't speak to anyone else, but he'd made up his mind by 12:30 p.m. By that time, no taillight pieces had been found, no one saw a body on the lawn, no surveillance video was pulled, and none of the first responders were interviewed. Nonetheless, Proctor and Buchanan had determined that Karen Reed was guilty, so they got in their car and drove to her parents' house in Dighton to seize her phone and car, which he knew was the murder weapon, based solely on what Jennifer McCabe had told him that Karen Reed had said. A cover-up is easier to cover up when you involve less people. It's not what the police did do during the investigation they made that made it a cover-up. It's what they intentionally didn't do. Proctor didn't interview Julie Nagel, Caitlin Albert, her boyfriend Tristan Morris, Brian Albert Jr., or any of the people who were admittedly at the house that night. Sarah Levinson was in the house that night, and her name was kept hidden from the defense for almost a year. Julie Nagel wasn't interviewed until 9 months after O'Keefe's death, and only after the defense filed a motion in which they pointed out how impossible it would be for no one to have seen a body on the lawn. Conveniently, for the first time at her interview, Julie Nagel told Proctor that she saw a dark, shadowy figure on the front lawn. She didn't say it was a body because she would have had to call police if she did, but calling it a dark, shadowy figure was her way of suggesting that something might have been there without implicating herself. Conveniently, at trial, Julie Nagel's story also evolved, this time claiming that the dark, shadowy figure was actually a 5 to 6 foot black blob. She testified that she realized the next day that the black blob was John O'Keefe, but didn't come forward to speak with police about it. Then there's Colin Albert. Despite admittedly being at Brian Albert's house that night, Colin wasn't interviewed by police until 18 months after John's death, and only in regards to him being a victim of alleged witness intimidation. Conveniently, on the day Karen Reed was arrested, Colin's mother, Julie Albert, sent Proctor's sister, Courtney, a text message offering a thank you gift to Proctor for not interviewing Colin. Instead of telling her that this was unethical, Proctor told her to give the gift to his wife, Elizabeth, instead. Colin Albert never had to hand over his phone or answer any questions from police. His existence at the house was hidden, despite the fact that Steve Scanlon somehow knew he was there that night. Colin claimed that he was home in bed by 12:30, but yet at 12:33, minutes after Reed left 34 Fairview and John O'Keefe's phone moved for the last time, Colin called a friend named Erin Beatty. She didn't answer, as kids at that age almost never call each other, and when she contacted him the next day, he goes, "Never mind." For telling people this story, Erin Beatty and her father, Tom Beatty, were harassed and ostracized by adults in the Canton community. Jennifer McCabe and her friend Jill Thomas reportedly told 17-year-old Erin Beatty to, quote, "put a dick in your mouth instead of talking so much." Chris Albert confronted Tom Beatty and tried to get him to say that Colin never called Erin that night. They were going out of their way to pressure the Beatty family to lie and cover for Colin. Since Colin didn't speak with police and his parents did the speaking for him, an alibi for Colin was finally presented at trial, claiming that he was picked up by Jennifer McCabe's daughter, Allie, at 12:10. As evidence, the Commonwealth submitted an unverified screenshot of a text message with the name Colin at the top. No cell break report, just a screenshot that Chris Albert gave prosecutor Adam Lally. At 12:10, Allie tells what she claims is Colin, "I'm here," but it doesn't say where here is. For all we know, she could have been picking up Colin to drive him to 34 Fairview, which would make sense because the party wasn't really starting until everyone else got back from the bar. Allie testified that she was driving people around all night and that Colin Albert was her last pickup at 12:10. She said she was home in bed by 12:30, but there was just one problem with that. Her Life 360 data shows that she was driving around till 1:30. But just like all the phone calls and Google searches in this case, the Commonwealth's response to this was that it was just a mistake. If we're to believe Colin's story, it would mean that a 17-year-old who likes to drink and party asked Allie McCabe for a ride to 34 Fairview Road to wish his much older cousin a happy birthday in person, then had her pick him up 90 minutes later in order to get him back home as soon as his fun uncle and his friends showed up to party. Right. Meanwhile, Chris Albert initially testified that he left the Waterfall bar and was home at between 12:05 and 12:10. He said that Colin got home 15 to 20 minutes later and came upstairs to say goodnight to his parents. There was a problem with that story, though. Chris is seen on surveillance video at the Waterfall bar at 12:13, and it would take him at least 7 to 8 minutes for him to walk home from there. By his own admittance, his son Colin got home much closer to 12:45, which meanwhile, Chris Albert initially testified that he left the Waterfall bar and was home at between 12:05 and 12:10. He said that Colin got home 15 to 20 minutes later and came upstairs to say goodnight to his parents. There was a problem with that story, though. Chris is seen on surveillance video at the Waterfall bar at 12:13, and it would take him at least 7 to 8 minutes for him to walk home from there. By his own admittance, his son Colin got home much closer to 12:45, which would mean that he was still at Brian Albert's house when John O'Keefe arrived. This is why the defense is so suspicious of Colin Albert. The McAlberts and the Commonwealth are insistent that Colin wasn't there when John O'Keefe was allegedly killed. But why would it matter if he was inside and John O'Keefe was killed outside by Karen Reed? Why did he call Erin Beatty, a girl he wasn't dating, out of the blue at 12:33? Why did his family try to silence the Beattys? Why did his mother offer Proctor a thank you gift? And why were his knuckles so cut up in a picture a few weeks later? Colin had an explanation for that too, which illustrated just how easily he could lie with a straight face.
And I was walking up the driveway and I slipped down the driveway and I tried to catch myself, but I had something in my left hand, so I had tried to brace myself with my right hand, and I ended up sliding a little bit down the driveway.
Right. Obviously, that was a lie, which begs the question, if he didn't do anything wrong, why did he have to lie? Colin also testified he'd never been in a fight before. Shortly after that, the internet found 3 videos of him fighting, proving that he lied about that too. Why lie if you have nothing to hide?
You're a bitch, bro. Fuck you.
Yeah, fuck you, you pussy.
Clean cold, boy. You be knocked out. KO. Bang, bang.
These are questions an investigator looking for the truth could have grilled him on. Colin was a hothead and previously had issues with O'Keefe. But when the lead investigator is Michael Proctor, whose mother describes Colin's family as a second family, you don't have to worry about being questioned by police. But perhaps the most obvious witness that Proctor went out of his way not to speak to was Brian Lucky Loughran. Proctor interviewed DPW Director Michael Trotta and claimed that Trotta told him that the Canton DPW does not plow Fairview Road. This was an outright lie. I tracked down Mr. Trotta and asked him myself.
Is there any reason that Lucky Loughran, Brian Loughran, would have been plowing that road at 2:30 in the morning?
We generally have 2 people on every route, so there's usually a town plow with a contract plow.
After that, I tracked down Lucky, who was happy to tell me what he witnessed that morning. Lucky said that he did first plow Brian Albert's house at 2:30 and didn't see a body on the lawn. When I asked him if he would have seen a body if a body was there, he was insistent that he would because bright lights and constantly looking on the yards and scanning sidewalks in case animals ran into the road. Lucky told me that when he tried to do another plow of Fairview Road an hour later, he couldn't because there was a Ford Edge parked in the exact spot where John O'Keefe's body would be discovered 3 hours later. At least 3 members of the Albert family, Kevin, Brian, and Colin, owned a Ford Edge at the time. If there was nobody on the lawn at 2:30, which Lucky Loughran and 7 other witnesses said there was not, then Karen Reed couldn't have struck him at 12:30. Then a Ford Edge appeared. Then there was a body. You do the math. The fact that the state police didn't put out an all points bulletin looking for that Ford Edge is all the evidence you need to know that this was a cover-up. Remember, this cover-up wasn't so much what the cops did to cover it up. It was what they chose not to do. Choosing not to interview Lucky Loughran was deliberate. They knew that if they spoke to him, he was going to say there wasn't a body on the front lawn. And logically, they'd have to pursue whoever was driving the Ford Edge since they were allegedly right next to a dead cop on the lawn. Michael Proctor didn't want to pursue any leads that didn't point to Karen Reed. The state police finally decided to interview Lucky Loughran 18 months after the death of John O'Keefe and 2 days after I published this bombshell interview with him. But Proctor and Buchanan weren't trying to learn more about the Ford Edge. They were trying to discredit his testimony and get him to say that I illegally wiretapped Lucky. At trial, Brian Tully testified that he didn't investigate the Ford Edge because Loughran couldn't possibly be sure it was a Ford Edge. But it had 4 wheels and an engine, and whoever was driving it was supposedly parked next to a dead body that police think was run over by a car. So wouldn't you want to find out who that person was and speak with them? Nah. Better just pin it on Karen Reed. Rather than question any of these witnesses, Proctor and Buchanan drove to Dighton to seize Karen Reed's car, which they hadn't seen yet, because they were certain that it was a murder weapon. No taillight had been discovered at the scene yet. At 2:30, they called and asked Dighton police for a tow. When they arrived an hour or so later, they didn't take a picture of Karen Reed's car to show the condition of the taillight before it had been towed. According to Michael Proctor's report, and as with all the witnesses, they didn't record any of their interviews with Karen. Reed's car was towed at 5:30 p.m. This time is critical because the state police began searching the area where John O'Keefe's body was discovered at 5:45 and found 4 pieces of taillight. If the car was towed at 5:30, then there was no way it could get from Dighton to Canton in a blizzard, normally a 40-minute drive, in time to plant taillight. But as it turned out, Michael Proctor was lying about what time he towed the car. Video surveillance from the Reed's house shows the car being towed at 4:12, and the Dighton police report confirmed this. This meant that Proctor was unaccounted for with Reed's car for 78 minutes and would have more than enough time to get the vehicle to Canton and plant taillight before the state police search at 5:45. Nevertheless, in pretrial hearings, the Commonwealth continued to lie about what time the car was towed. Adam Lally said in court filings that Bill Reed's ring video didn't reset for daylight savings, but the sun set that day at 4:56 and there was still sunlight in the video at 4:12. Eventually, after realizing that they couldn't lie their way out of this one, the Commonwealth called it a scrivener's error, even though the digits 412 are nowhere near 530 on a keyboard. The state police CERT team, led by Lieutenant O'Hara, began arriving at 34 Fairview Road at 4:51 to search the area where John's body was discovered. By that point, Proctor's commanding officer, Lieutenant Brian Tully, determined that O'Keefe was hit by a car and told O'Hara that they were looking for pieces of taillight. The scene was unsecured the entire day, and more than 18 inches of snow had fallen since the Canton police searched the area and didn't find a single piece of taillight. Internal messages show that the CERT team was ready to start digging at 5:30, but that Lieutenant Tully did not give them the green light. Time was of the essence, and snow was continuing to fall. What was Tully waiting for? Simple. They needed to wait for Karen Reed's car to arrive in Canton first. They could have brought the vehicle to any state police barracks close to Dighton, including Middleborough or Foxborough. Yet they insisted on bringing the car to the Canton Police Department less than 2 miles away from Brian Albert's house where Kevin Albert was working. The car is seen on video, which was shown for the first time in Reed's first trial, entering the Canton Police Sallyport garage at 5:36 p.m. Proctor could be seen hanging around what appears to be the left rear taillight, which was not broken. In other words, there was no evidence Proctor went anywhere near Reed's broken right rear taillight, except there's just one problem. The video shown in court was intentionally inverted. What appeared to be left was actually right, and Proctor was hanging out there for a while.
In the video, the word police appears backwards on another vehicle parked in the garage. So does the number 4 on one of the garage's overhead doors. Defense attorney Alan Jackson believes it was no accident.
The timestamp across the bottom is not inverted.
And there appears to be somebody standing near it.
Who's the guy in the watch cap, in the winter cap, back there by that right rear tail light the entire time by himself? That's Proctor.
The Commonwealth was trying to deceive the jury. The cover-up was happening right in front of millions of people. For 20 seconds at 5:37, the video cuts out. And when it begins again, you could see another unknown man who was not in the video before, leaving the area where Proctor was standing by the right rear taillight. Who was this man? And did he have pieces of taillight with him when he left? Was it Kevin Albert or Brian Higgins' close friend, Chief Ken Berkowitz? The Commonwealth still can't can't explain who that was. But coincidentally, 5 minutes later, after that, Lieutenant Tully gave the CERT team the go-ahead to begin their search. Lieutenant O'Hara testified that he had no idea who several members of the CERT team were, but said that he believed they were Canton police. Minutes after they began searching, someone, they never said who, found a piece of red taillight under 18 inches of snow. This was the exact same area Lieutenant Gallagher searched on video during the daylight with the leaf blower on video and did not find any taillight. Yet the CERT team was able to find it under all that snow with minimal effort in the dark 10 minutes after Reed's car arrived at Canton Police. Whoever this officer who found the taillight was never testified at trial. They also found John's missing size 12 shoe that the Canton Police completely missed during their search. So either the Canton Police are blind and incompetent, or the taillight and the shoe were planted. Shortly after that, someone on the CERT team found 3 more pieces of taillight. Once again, we don't know who, but Brian Tully had seen enough. And now that he had some physical evidence linking Reed to the crime scene, he shut down the search. O'Hara offered to come back the next day in the daylight to search some more, but Tully told them he was all set. Instead, the state police were instructed to drive by on their way to work to see if any taillight presented itself. And wouldn't you know it, it did. Over the course of the next 3 weeks, Chief Berkowitz, Sergeant Buchanan, and Proctor found a total of 47 pieces of red taillight. The pieces actually became bigger as time went by, leading to this dinner-sized plate discovered by Proctor on February 18th. You got that? Canton Police, the CERT team, and everyone who went to the house for 3 weeks didn't see that piece of taillight just a few feet from the curb. Of course, Proctor didn't take any pictures of any of this because documenting isn't really his thing. After all, it's just the murder of a cop. Who cares about completely incorrect police reports? No chain of custody and a complete lack of documentation. You would think after the second or third time the taillight presented itself that the state police would have preserved the crime scene, but not these Keystone cops. They just kept doing their drive-bys until they could put the entire taillight together like a jigsaw puzzle. Here's the problem though. Reed's taillight did not look like this when she pulled out of John's driveway at 507 seconds after backing into his car. As you can see, the taillight was cracked, but not completely broken. Don't take my word for it. Listen to Dayton Police Sergeant Nicholas Barros, who observed the condition of the taillight at the Reed house and made sure to point out,
I saw that there was some damage to the right rear taillight. To my best ability and recollection, that taillight was not completely damaged. It was cracked and a piece was missing, but not completely damaged.
perhaps the biggest obstacle for the Commonwealth was explaining John O'Keefe's injuries. In the words of John's brother, Paul O'Keefe, John looked like he had gone 5 rounds with Mike Tyson. People who get backed into cars have bruises and broken bones, but not John O'Keefe. Instead, John had 2 black eyes, a 3-inch laceration in the back of the head that looks like he was hit by a blunt object, and parallel linear cuts exclusively on his right arm. And did I mention that Brian Albert owned an aggressive German Shepherd named Chloe with a documented history of biting strangers and dogs? They tried to hide this from the court by opposing a defense motion for Canton animal control records and having Brian Albert's attorney, Greg Henning, lie in open court by claiming that Chloe never bit a human being. Animal control records show that Chloe sent at least 2 people to the ER. According to Dr. Marie Russell, who has done thousands of autopsies, those are dog bites on John's arm. And guess what? The 6-year-old family dog was suddenly rehomed a few months after John's murder. They claim that Chloe is somewhere in Vermont, but won't say where. Oh, and they sold the house and they ripped up the basement floor too, but there's nothing suspicious about that. The Commonwealth originally claimed that Karen Reed struck John O'Keefe while doing a 3-point turn, and they stuck to this theory for the first 18 months after Reed's arrest. But after a turtle rider pointed out that it would have meant that the wrong taillight was broken, they quickly abandoned that theory. So how did John get those cuts on his arm? Surely the grass didn't do that, and if he had gotten run over, then his body would be covered in bruises and broken bones. The jury needed an explanation from an expert, and that's where this guy came in. Trooper Joseph Paul is Norfolk County's crash reconstruction expert, and he's got an associate's degree in administration to prove it. For the first time at trial, the Commonwealth explained that John was actually standing in the middle of a blizzard with his arm extended into the street. He had just gotten into a huge fight with Karen, and even though everyone was out that night, they seemed happy together. According to Trooper Paul, Karen Reed, who was parked in front of the neighbor's house for some reason, began gunning it in reverse, hitting 24 miles an hour in just 62 feet. She sideswiped John O'Keefe and the taillight hit John exclusively in the arm that was hanging out over the road for some reason. This caused the taillight to shatter into 47 pieces, all of which the Canton Police Department couldn't find in broad daylight. After striking John's arm, it caused him to then catapult 30 feet and do a pirouette in midair before hitting his head on the curb and then bouncing another 10 feet onto the grass, where he finally came to his final resting place on top of his phone. How did his phone end up underneath him, you ask? Trooper Paul had an answer for that too.
What's your theory on how that cell phone ended up flying 30 feet with it?
It just did.
Just did. And somehow, as he landed, tucked that cell phone underneath his body, so he landed on top of it.
It just did. That's the evidence at the scene. I didn't put the evidence there. So.
Well, you didn't.
It just did. Okay. And how did he get the laceration in the back of his head? Simple. The grass did it. You see, it was cold out that day, and when it gets cold, the ground turns into a blunt object that causes a cut like this, which looks like Professor Plum hit you with a lead pipe. I decided to test this theory out to see if it was even possible to accelerate to 24 miles an hour and 62 feet.
This is 62 feet. We're going to mark it off right here. All right. Boom. All right. And that's where 62 feet is. See my car up there? See where the chalk mark is on the ground? That's 62 feet. So look at, you marked 62 feet off, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where Karen Reed started. That's where the back of her car started, okay? And you see the line down there, the other line, that's where he got hit. Okay, so I mean, that's 62 feet. So this dude just stood here and is like, yeah, come hit me. Come hit me. Like, look at, by the way, look how far away the car is. You see somebody coming at you in reverse like that? That's plenty of time to get away, right?
Oh, yeah.
Just jump out of the way.
The first time I hit 14 miles per hour and ended up driving over the curb because the road curves right where his body was found.
You're on the curb.
Am I really?
Yeah, you're on the grass.
Then I got up to 17 miles an hour, and finally, when I put the pedal to the metal, I was able to hit 19.
So I hit 19 miles an hour there. That was pretty, that felt fast as shit.
Yeah, it looked fast.
And let me tell you, it was scary. Try going that fast in reverse, and you'll see that it feels like a roller coaster. It's not natural. There's no possible way you can accidentally run into someone at that speed. Keep in mind, I did this in perfect conditions with a Lexus that had a comparable engine to Reed's car. I couldn't come close to 24 miles an hour, and I wasn't a good enough driver to avoid the curb. But the Commonwealth would have you believe that Karen Reed transformed into a NASCAR driver, hitting 24 miles an hour in 62 feet, cutting the wheel just in time to intentionally hit her target in the arm. Oh yeah, and no one inside the house saw or heard it happen. And they call us conspiracy theorists. You don't have to be a doctor to realize that this was complete bullshit. But luckily, the defense had not one, but two doctors who testified as to the scientific reasoning why John O'Keefe wasn't hit by a car. Dr. Daniel Wolf and Dr. Andrew Rentschler are crash reconstruction experts who work for a company called ARCA. They have contracts with the Department of Defense and the NHL and were hired by someone, the defense wasn't allowed to say who, at trial, to run tests in order to see if John O'Keefe's injuries could have come from a motor vehicle collision. They made it clear that the laws of physics said that John O'Keefe could not have been hit by a car and that a side swipe would not knock him out of his shoe. So not only does the red taillight bloom on Brian Albert's front lawn like a perennial plant every February, but Newton's laws of physics also ceased to exist there at that time. After Reed was indicted for murder, arrested, and released on a $100,000 bail, she realized the Commonwealth was pressuring her to take a plea deal for manslaughter. Video footage of her arrest and booking on June 9th, 2023 shows Reed telling Sergeant Buchanan,
okay, you're aware he was beaten up by Brian Albert. I mean, we're all in on the same joke, right? My taillight was cracked and John was pulverized.
Karen realized that she was up against the most powerful and corrupt government officials who felt political pressure to get a conviction for an alleged cop killer. In September of 2022, she hired high-profile LA-based attorney Alan Jackson and his associate Elizabeth Little, specifically because of Jackson's experience with cell phone data extraction. Jackson had previously represented Kevin Spacey in Nantucket after he was falsely accused of sexually assaulting a young man. The data extraction showed that a number of exculpatory inflammatory text messages from the alleged victim's phone were deleted by his mother, Heather Unruh, a WCVB reporter, and Jackson got the case thrown out. In October of 2022, the Reed team filed a motion asking the court to order that several people inside the house, including Brian Albert and Brian Higgins, preserve their phones. For the first time, they put on the record their theory that John O'Keefe was killed inside the house and that Karen was framed afterward. Shortly after the motion was filed, Brian Albert's youngest brother, Tim Albert, posted this ominous, threatening message on Facebook telling the world that if you fuck with his family, he won't hesitate to make you the most miserable person. Judge Peter Krupp allowed the motion for the preservation order, but the day before it was to be put into place, Brian Albert and Brian Higgins were tipped off to it by the Norfolk County DA's victim witness advocate, Steve Nelson. Brian Albert immediately got rid of his phone, and Higgins removed his SIM card, placed the phone and SIM card in separate trash bags, and drove them to an army base in Cape Cod where he disposed of them in a dumpster. They both pretended that this was normal when they testified. Back to the ARCA experts. Guess who hired them? Not the defense. It was actually the FBI. Shortly after the addition of Jackson and Little, Reed's defense team reached out to the United States Attorney's Office because they believed their client was the victim of a police cover-up and corruption in the DA's office. The USAO easily could have ignored them, but they found their claims credible and ended up launching an investigation into the investigation of John O'Keefe sometime around December of 2022. On April 10th, 2023, Colin Albert was visited in his Bridgewater State dorm room by two FBI officials with the subpoena to appear before a federal grand jury. Several others inside the house also received summons, including Brian Albert and Brian Higgins. I wrote my first story in the Canton cover-up a week later, and the Karen Reed case blew up overnight. In May of 2023, Lucky Loughran was also visited by two FBI agents as he repeated the same story that he told me. There was no body on Brian Albert's front lawn at 2:30. Everyone in the house immediately lawyered up. Brian Albert's family hired attorney Greg Henning. Colin Albert hired Joe Krowski Jr. and Higgins hired Brian Connolly. Higgins immediately cut tie with the Albert family and began ignoring their messages. Clearly, they were worried about what Higgins would tell the grand jury. This prompted Kevin Albert to send a text message to Higgins telling him that he was making everyone worried. But worried about what? Just tell him the guy never came in the house. Jennifer McCabe, Matt McCabe, Brian Albert, Colin Albert, Sarah Levinson, Julie Nagel, Michael Proctor, and several others ended up testifying before a closed-door grand jury session. Although no indictments have come as of yet, the FBI hired ARCA to see if Karen Reed could be ruled out as a suspect. She was. From there, they began secretly monitoring the McAlberts and Proctor's phones, and their suspicious, incriminating text messages were included in a 3,000-page report that was given to both the Commonwealth and the defense shortly before trial. The report is what showed Brian Albert and Higgins were tipped off to destroy their phones. The investigation discovered that Albert and Higgins lied to the state grand jury that indicted Karen Reed when they testified they were sleeping at 2 a.m. At 2:22 a.m., Albert called Higgins, but Higgins didn't answer. Higgins called back right away and they spoke for 22 seconds. After being confronted with the fact that they clearly lied about being asleep, Higgins and Albert came up with a new lie. They butt dialed and butt answered each other. In fact, Albert testified that after drinking all day, the man in his 50s decided to have sex with his wife Nicole, and while they were having sex, he butt answered Higgins' butt dial. A February 1st, 2022 group text message with the McCabes and Alberts shows that Matt McCabe was telling the others to instruct Chris Albert to tell the media,
"Tell them the guy never went in the house," correct?
Yes.
Mr. McCabe, who was the guy that you were referring to? Does he have a name?
That would be John.
Why would they need to instruct Chris Albert, who wasn't at 34 Fairview Road that night, to say this if John never came inside the house? The text also showed that the McAlberts were heavily monitoring police activity at the scene and discussing who was telling the police what. A Quantico-trained forensic expert from the FBI also confirmed that Jennifer McCabe's Google search happened at 2:27. But perhaps the most damning thing the FBI discovered were Michael Proctor's text messages. On the evening of January 29th, 2022, when one of his friends named Bird asked Proctor if the homeowner would, quote, get some shit for having a dead cop on his lawn, Proctor responded by saying, "Nope, homeowner is a Boston cop," literally saying that the reason Brian Albert wouldn't be treated as a potential suspect, as he normally would, was because of his status as a police officer. The messages with his friends that night show that he had already decided that Karen Reed and Karen Reed alone was guilty, telling them that there would be, quote, serious charges brought on the girl. He couldn't hide his disdain for Karen Reed, telling his friends,
"She's a whack job."
These are your words, Trooper Proctor?
Yes, Your Honor.
Go ahead and say them.
them?
Cunt. Yeah, she's a babe. Weird Fall River accent, though. No ass.
When asked if she would be skating on the charges, he replied, 0 chances she skates. She's fucked. He told them that, quote, all the powers that be want answers ASAP, indicating political pressure to charge Reed quickly. Proctor's text not only showed his bias, it showed what a pig he was. When asked if she was attractive, Proctor made fun of her medical condition.
She's got a leaky balloon knot, leaks poo.
On the day that she was indicted, Proctor texted fellow Norfolk State Police Detective David DeChico and said that Reed was attractive.
If you like women who shit themselves.
Right before arresting Reed for murder on June 9th, Proctor texted his wife Elizabeth and told her, we're gonna lock this whack job up. On August 17th, in a group text that included his superior officers, Lieutenant Fanning and Sergeant Buchanan, Proctor said that he was going through David Yanetti's
retarded client's phone. No nude so far. I hate that man. I truly hate him.
Since Yanetti was alleging that Proctor's investigation was flawed. Proctor's text also showed that he and DeChico discussed ways to manipulate the medical examiner. Proctor called M.E. Irene Scortibello a whack job because her report said that the cause of John's death was undetermined. DeChico mocked Proctor for not being able to pressure the M.E. to come back with the homicide determination. Proctor really hated Scortibello, and she turned out to be a great witness for the defense at the trial because she testified that John could have been hit with a blunt object. Perhaps most disturbing was Proctor's text messages with his sister Courtney, in which they both talk about how they hope Karen Reed kills herself so that the O'Keefe family didn't have to sit through a trial. Jurors were never told about the federal investigation, so they had no idea that all of these text messages came from the feds, or that ARCA was hired by the feds, or that the investigation itself was so suspect that the U.S. Attorney himself, Josh Levy, had conducted a grand jury in which all these witnesses were grilled about their lies. Jurors afterwards said that they thought ARCA was paid to lie by Karen Reed's car insurance company. Had they known about the federal investigation, it certainly would have impacted their verdict, which is exactly why Judge Beverly Cannoni didn't allow it to be mentioned in court. Speaking of Judge Cannoni, the former public defender hasn't exactly tried to hide her obvious bias for the favor of the Commonwealth. Judge Cannoni wouldn't allow the defense to hold an evidentiary hearing. She allowed the Commonwealth witnesses who aren't doctors to testify about the causation of injuries, but not defense witnesses, and put sanctions on defense attorneys over a misunderstanding involving paying for witnesses' travel expenses, but never once reprimanded the Commonwealth for presenting an inverted video at trial. In July of 2023, the defense filed a motion to recuse the judge after Matt McCabe's brother Sean messaged this award-winning journalist and said that he was going to murder me and bury my corpse in the front yard of Auntie Bev's seaside cottage. Somehow, Sean McCabe knew that Cannoni owned a seaside cottage down the Cape that was just a couple miles from his house. Additionally, Judge Cannoni's brother is a lawyer who represented Chris Albert in 1994 when Albert was convicted of killing a Hungarian foreign exchange student in a hit-and-run car crash. To the surprise of no one, Judge Cannoni denied the motion to recuse after determining that she wasn't biased. Little did I realize that Sean McCabe was going to be the least of my problems. You see, I was too effective at getting the word out about the Commonwealth's blatant corruption. I was holding protests on the courthouse steps before hearings, and even held a rolling rally in Canton where we stopped in the homes of the McAlberts and Proctors for 5 minutes each, and I explained to the crowd of 100 or so people what they'd done to cover up the murder of John O'Keefe. The state police and Norfolk DA's office really didn't like this. In August of 23, DA Michael Morrissey issued a press release video in which he inappropriately vouched for the truthfulness of the McAlberts, said that Michael Proctor didn't know any of the witnesses, and demanded that the protests stop. But of course we didn't.
Colin Albert didn't commit murder. Jennifer McCabe, Matthew McCabe, and Brian Albert. These people were not part of a conspiracy and certainly did not commit murder or any crime that night. They have been forthcoming with authority, providing statements, and have not engaged in any cover-up. They are not suspects in any crime. They are merely witnesses in the case. Trooper Proctor had no close personal relationship with any of the parties involved in the investigation. And had no conflict. And he had no reason to step out of the investigation. Every suggestion to the contrary is a lie.
On September 25th, 2023, I published a story after getting a tip that a car resembling Jennifer McCabe's was seen parked at the Proctor's house. If true, it would mean that Morrissey had lied in his statement about the Proctors not being friends with any of the witnesses. In order to verify this, I asked Turtle Riders if one of them could run a license plate for me and gave them the license plate number of the car parked outside Proctor's house. Several people ran it for me, but one of them was an Avon police dispatcher named Janelle Webb, and it was traced back to her. For the crime of peacefully protesting, reporting the news, and exposing the fact that Michael Morrissey is a liar, I was arrested on October 11th, 2023 at my kid's bus stop and charged with 9 counts of felony witness intimidation, 3 counts of picketing, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit witness intimidation. I was indicted 2 months later. Since I was out on bail, another charge would mean that my bail could be revoked for 60 days. Naturally then, Brian Tully and Special Prosecutor Ken Mello began conspiring with the side chick I was seeing on Friday nights, deputized her as a witness, and got her her to invite me over her apartment so that they could falsely accuse me of hitting her and have me charged with witness intimidation. For that, I was sentenced to 60 days in jail on my birthday, the day after Christmas. The trial began on April of 2024 and lasted almost 3 months. On the final day of closing statements, Judge Kearney called up a juror who was visibly disgusted by the Commonwealth throughout most of the trial and told her that she'd been reported by Lieutenant John Fanning, who was somehow in charge of juror security, for allegedly talking about the case at a bar 6 weeks prior. And Judge Kearney then appointed a former cop who was hit by a car to be the jury foreman, exempting him from the lottery that would determine who the alternates were. Clerk Jim McDermott drew 2 numbers out of a bucket but didn't show anyone in court what those numbers were. 2 other jurors who planned on voting not guilty were named alternates and not allowed to deliberate. After 5 days of deliberations,
the deep division is not due to a lack of effort or diligence, but rather a sincere adherence to our individual principles and moral convictions. To continue to deliberate would be futile and only serve to force us to compromise these deeply held beliefs. I'm not going to do that to you folks. Your service is complete. I'm declaring a mistrial in this case.
Judge Kearney declared a mistrial without polling any of the jurors. Just when you thought things couldn't get any more corrupt, jurors started speaking out afterward.
The one charge that we were not very clear on and not everybody was in agreement with was essentially the manslaughter charge, involuntary manslaughter. So that was the one that we were not clear on. But the other 2 charges, which was essentially second-degree murder as well as leaving a scene of an accident, was very clear. We all 12 agreed that was not the case.
And since the jury instructions were not clear, they had no idea that they could acquit on 2 charges and hang on the 3rd. So now Karen Reed will have to face those charges again, despite half the jury coming forward and swearing that they voted to acquit her. Trial 2 will be very different from the first trial. Micah Proctor has been fired, and it's unclear if he or the disastrous Joseph Hall will be called as witnesses by the Commonwealth. We know that they've abandoned several of their own witnesses that were favorable to Karen Reed, and they've added fake YouTube doctors as expert witnesses who will try to prove that Trooper Paul what he couldn't do in the first trial. The Norfolk County DA's office has hired mob attorney Hank Brennan, a close personal friend of mass murderer Whitey Bulger, to be lead prosecutor for the Commonwealth. They have dozens of ADAs who get paid to do that job already, but all of them refused to do it, and there was no way they were going with Lunchbox Lally again. Brennan claimed that he wanted to ensure Karen Reed got a fair trial, but since taking over, he spent most of his time trying to prevent her witnesses from testifying. Thus far, Brennan has shown a deep personal obsession with getting things he's not entitled to, like phone records for me and everyone in Karen Reed's family. But the facts and the science remain on the side of Karen Reed. Some may say that it's hard to believe that this many people could be involved in a conspiracy, but it's really not that complicated. 5 well-connected people with ties to law enforcement, Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Matt McCabe, Jennifer McCabe, and Brian Higgins, spoke to police after being alone for hours and getting their simple story straight. The guy never came in the house. The lead detective was from Canton, and his family called the Alberts a second family. All he had to do was cover for them, plant some taillight, and avoid doing normal detective work. His bosses instinctively covered for him because cops don't snitch on other cops. From there, it's just people trusting institutions. It all makes sense. It all fits. Karen Reed defying the laws of physics, cell phone data no longer being reliable evidence, and eyewitnesses not seeing something that they definitely should have seen does not make any sense. There can never be justice for John O'Keefe without justice for Karen Reed. She is undeniably innocent, which means by default that the McAlberts are undeniably guilty. We may never know exactly what happened to John O'Keefe when he went inside Brian Albert's house, but we know as a fact that he was beaten up by several people, attacked by a dog, and thrown out on the lawn to die in the cold. We know as a fact that the state police are well aware of this and that they allowed Michael Proctor to intentionally subvert justice. But we also know that we will never stop fighting for justice until Karen Reed is free. As we now head into trial 2, we are expecting more facts proving Karen Reed's innocence to come out in court. I will be there every step of the way, documenting, reporting, and fighting for real justice for John O'Keefe and for Karen Reed.